before the pyramids became symbols of Egypt, before the golden mask of Tutankhamun was ever buried beneath the desert, and long before Cleopatra stood at the edge of a collapsing kingdom, there was only the river, the Nile. It moved slowly through a landscape where almost everything beyond its banks was dry, harsh, and silent. To one side stretched the desert, to the other another desert. Yet along that narrow ribbon of water, something extraordinary was beginning. People settled. Fields appeared. Villages became towns. And over thousands of years, those settlements would become one of the longest-lasting civilizations the world has ever known. Tonight, let the modern world become quiet. Imagine the sound of water moving gently through darkness. Imagine warm desert air cooling beneath a sky crowded with stars. Imagine distant reeds moving in the night wind, while somewhere along the river, a small wooden boat passes silently through the darkness. There are no modern lights, no engines, no cities glowing beyond the horizon, only the Nile. And beside it, the first generations of a civilization that would eventually build pyramids, raise enormous temples, create elaborate tombs, develop a complex writing system, and spend thousands of years trying to understand what happens after death. This is shaded past. And tonight, we travel deep into the ancient world of Egypt. So settle back, let your breathing slow, and allow the story to unfold at its own quiet pace. Our journey begins not with a pharaoh, but with the land itself. Because before Egypt had kings, temples, armies, or monuments, it had geography. And geography, more than almost anything else, shaped what Egypt would become. The Nile flows northward through northeastern Africa before emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. To a modern traveler, the river may appear simply as a long body of water passing through a desert. But to the people who lived beside it thousands of years ago, the Nile was something far greater. It was food. It was transportation. It was water. It was fertile soil. It was a calendar. And, in time, it became part of their understanding of the universe itself. Every year, the river's waters rose. The flood spread outward across the valley, covering the fields with a layer of dark sediment carried from farther south. Then the waters gradually receded. Behind them was fertile ground. Farmers planted. Grain grew. Animals grazed. Harvests were gathered. And the cycle began again. In a world where drought could destroy an entire community, the relative predictability of the Nile created a powerful foundation for permanent settlement. The river did not make life effortless. Floods could vary. Crops could fail. Disease could spread. Political conflicts could disrupt food supplies. But compared with many surrounding regions, the Nile Valley offered an extraordinary opportunity. People could stay. They could build. They could store grain. They could raise families in the same communities across generations. And when generations remain in one place, something begins to happen. Memory becomes geography. A village becomes ancestral land. A burial place becomes sacred. A local shrine becomes a temple. A successful family becomes a powerful family. And eventually, powerful families begin competing for control. Long before the first pharaohs ruled a united Egypt, communities along the Nile were already developing their own identities. The northern region, where the river spread into a broad delta before reaching the Mediterranean, would become known as Lower Egypt. Farther south, along the narrower valley, lay Upper Egypt. The names can be confusing because Upper Egypt was geographically south of Lower Egypt. But the distinction reflected the direction of the Nile's flow and the ancient Egyptian understanding of the landscape. These two regions shared the same river. They also shared many cultural traditions. But they developed separate political centers and symbols. And eventually, the competition between them would help produce one of the defining moments in ancient Egyptian history. The creation of a unified kingdom. The exact story of that unification is more complicated than later traditions sometimes suggest. Ancient Egyptian history often preserves the memory of a ruler called Menes. Later evidence connects the beginning of the unified state with the king Narmer. Whether one ruler personally accomplished the entire process or whether political unification unfolded over generations, the result was transformative. Two lands became one kingdom. A royal institution emerged with extraordinary power. And Egypt entered a new phase of history. The king stood at the center. But the Egyptian king was not understood simply as a politician. He occupied a sacred position. The Egyptians believed that the universe depended upon balance. They called this principle Ma'at. Ma'at represented order, truth, justice, harmony, and the proper arrangement of the world. The Nile needed to rise at the proper time. The sun needed to cross the sky. The seasons needed to follow their expected rhythm. Society needed to remain stable. The dead needed to reach their proper destination. And the king had a sacred responsibility to maintain this balance. This was one of the reasons Egyptian kingship became so powerful. The ruler was not merely collecting taxes or commanding soldiers. He was participating in the maintenance of cosmic order. In the Egyptian imagination, political stability and universal stability were deeply connected. A weak king could therefore represent more than political inconvenience. He could represent disorder. And disorder was dangerous. The early rulers established important administrative centers. One of the most significant was Memphis, situated near the boundary between the Nile Valley and the Delta. From centers like this, the kingdom could be managed. Grain could be collected. Land could be measured. Workers could be organized. Taxes could be assessed. Goods could be distributed. And information could be recorded. That last development would become especially important. Because Egypt was not only building a government. It was building a memory. Writing emerged in ancient Egypt around the beginning of the dynastic period. The most famous form was hieroglyphic writing. To modernize, hieroglyphs can look like a collection of beautiful symbols. Birds, eyes, hands, reeds, animals, tools, and abstract signs. But these images were part of a sophisticated writing system. They could represent sounds. They could represent words. They could provide meaning or clarification. And they could transform stone into a permanent record. This mattered deeply in Egyptian culture. A person's name was connected to their continued existence. To preserve a name was, in an important sense, to preserve the person. To erase a name could therefore become a symbolic attack on memory itself. Thousands of years later, this belief would help us understand why ancient rulers placed their names on monuments everywhere. They were not simply advertising themselves. They were attempting to defeat oblivion. At first, royal tombs were very different from the pyramids that would later dominate the Egyptian landscape. Early kings were buried in structures known as mastabas. These were large rectangular monuments with flat roofs and sloping sides. Beneath them lay burial chambers. Above them were spaces connected with offerings and remembrance. But Egyptian architecture was about to change. During the reign of King Djoser, a remarkable official named Imhotep became associated with one of the most important architectural experiments in human history. At Saqqara, the royal burial monument developed upward. One level was placed above another. The result was the step pyramid. It was unlike anything that had come before it on such a scale. Stone was being used not merely as a construction material, but as a statement of permanence. The monument rose above the desert. Its layers seemed to lead upward, and perhaps that was part of its meaning. The king's tomb was no longer simply a place hidden within the earth. It became a structure that transformed the landscape. A statement visible from great distances. A monument intended to endure. The step pyramid would influence generations of builders. And soon, Egyptian rulers would begin experimenting with even larger forms. King Sneferu was one of the most important figures in that process. His reign was associated with several enormous pyramid projects. One of them developed a distinctive change in angle partway up its sides, producing what is now known as the bent pyramid. Another, the Red Pyramid, demonstrated a more successful approach to creating a true smooth-sided pyramid. These experiments reveal something that is easy to overlook when standing before the finished monuments. The Egyptians did not simply know how to build pyramids. They learned how to build them. They made mistakes. They adjusted angles. They changed construction methods. They experimented with materials. They solved problems. And each generation inherited the lessons of the previous one. Then came the plateau that would become perhaps the most famous archaeological landscape on Earth, Giza. And the king whose name would become permanently connected with its greatest monument, Khufu. The Great Pyramid. Even after thousands of years, it is difficult to look at the Great Pyramid without confronting its scale. Its original height was roughly 146 meters. Its base covered a vast area. Millions of stone blocks were quarried, moved, shaped, and positioned. The monument demanded enormous quantities of food, tools, timber, rope, stone, and human labor. But perhaps the most impressive part was not the individual blocks. It was the organization required to bring everything together. Imagine the project from the perspective of an ordinary worker. You wake before sunrise. The desert air is cool. The horizon begins to brighten. Around you, other workers are already moving. Some carry tools. Others prepare food. Teams organize ropes and sledges. Stone arrives. Instructions move from one supervisor to another. There are people responsible for quarrying. People responsible for transporting. People responsible for feeding workers. People responsible for measuring. People responsible for maintaining tools. People responsible for recording supplies. And above all of them is the state. The pyramid is therefore not simply a tomb. It is an enormous demonstration of centralized organization. For decades, popular imagination sometimes portrayed the pyramids as monuments built primarily by vast armies of chained slaves. The actual evidence presents a more complicated picture. The workforce included skilled craftsmen and organized laborers, many of whom appear to have been housed and fed by the state. Agricultural workers may also have participated during periods when the annual flood reduced the need for field labor. This does not mean pyramid construction was easy. It was demanding, dangerous, physically exhausting. But the evidence points toward a highly organized labor system rather than a simple story of mass enslavement. And that distinction matters, because the pyramids were created by human beings, not by mysterious forces, not by lost supercivilizations, not by machines from another world. They were created by people who understood stone, geometry, transport, logistics, and administration. People who could look at a mountain of limestone and imagine a monument. The Great Pyramid originally had a smooth outer casing of polished limestone. When sunlight struck those surfaces, the monument would have looked dramatically different from the weathered stone structure visible today. It would have appeared bright, almost luminous, a manufactured mountain rising above the desert. Nearby stood another extraordinary monument, the Great Sphinx, a colossal figure with the body of a lion and a human head. Its precise origins and original symbolism have been debated, but it belongs to the monumental world of the Giza complex. The lion was associated with strength and royal power. The human face connected that power to kingship. Together, they created an image that still dominates the imagination. But Giza was not simply a landscape of monuments. It was a working environment. There were settlements, workshops, storage areas, bakeries, breweries, administrative buildings. People lived and worked around the royal projects. The pyramid complex depended upon an entire supporting economy. Stone had to be quarried. Food had to be produced. Animals had to be transported. Tools had to be manufactured. Workers had to be organized. The Nile became the great transportation system. Boats could carry heavy materials much more efficiently than people dragging everything across the desert. And so the river connected the distant parts of the project. Stone moved. Grain moved. People moved. Information moved. Egypt's civilization depended upon movement along a river that looked deceptively simple. The great monuments therefore tell us something about power. The pharaoh could command resources from across the kingdom. The state could mobilize thousands of people. And the kingdom could transform those resources into architecture that survived for millennia. Yet no matter how powerful a king appears in stone, political power remains fragile. The old kingdom eventually weakened. The centralized system that had supported the great pyramid building tradition began to fracture. Regional officials gained influence. The authority of the central government declined. And environmental changes may have contributed to the instability. Variations in Nile flooding could have serious consequences. If the flood was too low, crops suffered. If agricultural production declined, food became more difficult to distribute. If food distribution became unstable, political authority could weaken. The connection between nature and government was therefore impossible to escape. Egypt's civilization depended upon a river, and the river did not always behave exactly as people wanted. The Old Kingdom entered a period of political fragmentation later called the First Intermediate Period. From the perspective of later Egyptians, this was remembered as an age of disorder. But it is important to imagine the people living through it. The world had not simply ended. Villages continued. Farmers continued planting. Families continued living. Priests continued performing rituals. Local rulers continued governing their territories. The great centralized kingdom had weakened, but Egyptian culture survived. And eventually, another political reunification emerged. The Middle Kingdom. Rulers from southern Egypt restored central authority. Administration became stronger. Trade expanded. Egypt pushed farther south toward Nubia. Fortifications were established. And the kingdom became powerful again. But the character of Egyptian culture was also changing. The Middle Kingdom produced an extraordinary body of literature. Egyptian writers explored questions about leadership, justice, suffering, loyalty, and uncertainty. The ideal king could now be imagined not only as a distant divine figure but also as a protector of the people. A ruler was expected to understand suffering, to maintain order, to protect the vulnerable, to ensure that justice remained possible. These ideas reveal something important. Ancient Egypt was not a civilization without questions. Its people were thinking deeply about power and mortality. They knew kings could fail. They knew life could be uncertain. They knew that prosperity could disappear. And they wrote about those problems. The Middle Kingdom also strengthened Egypt's relationship with Nubia. To the south lay a region rich in resources, including gold. Trade routes connected Egypt with neighboring lands. Expeditions traveled through difficult terrain. Egyptian influence expanded. And once again, the Nile functioned as the central artery. But another transformation was coming. This time, it would involve people arriving from outside the traditional political centers of Egypt. In the northern part of the country, foreign groups became increasingly powerful. Eventually, rulers known as the Hyksos established themselves in the delta. Their origins and relationship with the local population were more complex than the simple label of foreign invader suggests. They became part of the political landscape. And from their position in the north, they controlled much of Egypt while rulers in Thebes maintained authority in the south. The divided kingdom created a new military environment. Egyptian rulers encountered technologies and methods of warfare associated with the Near East. The horse-drawn chariot became an important military tool. Composite bows offered greater range and power. Weapons and military organization evolved. Eventually, Theban rulers began pushing north. The conflict was not simply a single dramatic battle. It unfolded over time, and the final victory came under Ahmose I. The Hyksos were expelled from Egypt. The kingdom was reunified, and Egypt entered the period historians now call the New Kingdom. This was the age when Egypt became an international power. The Nile Valley was no longer the entire center of Egyptian ambition. Egyptian armies moved into the Levant. Campaigns were launched beyond the traditional borders. Foreign rulers sent tribute. Goods entered the royal treasury, and temples became increasingly wealthy. The pharaoh was now not only the sacred ruler of the Nile Valley. He was an imperial monarch. The wealth of empire transformed Egyptian architecture. At Thebes, enormous temples expanded. Karnak grew into one of the greatest religious complexes of the ancient world. Imagine approaching it thousands of years ago. The desert sun is bright. Ahead, enormous stone walls rise above you. Massive gateways frame the entrance. Beyond them, forests of columns stretch into the distance. Obelisks rise toward the sky. Statues of kings stand along ceremonial routes. Priests move through sacred spaces. Offerings are carried. Incense fills the air. The temple is not simply a building. It is a world, a political center, an economic institution, a religious sanctuary, a place where the king's relationship with the gods is constantly reaffirmed. Among the gods, Ammonius became particularly powerful during the New Kingdom. His temple at Karnak accumulated enormous wealth and influence. The relationship between pharaoh and priesthood therefore became increasingly important. The king needed religious legitimacy. The temples needed royal patronage. And the wealth of Egypt flowed through institutions that were both sacred and economic. Then, during this age of enormous royal power, a woman stepped into a role traditionally dominated by men. Her name was Hatshepsut. She began as queen, but eventually, she took the title and symbols of pharaoh. Her reign is especially remembered for its emphasis on trade and construction. One of her most famous achievements was an expedition to Punt. Punt remains difficult to identify with certainty, but the expedition brought back valuable goods, including incense-producing plants and other exotic products. The journey was recorded in reliefs. Ships traveled south. Goods were loaded. Foreign landscapes were depicted. And the expedition became a statement of prosperity. Hatshepsut also built one of the most visually striking monuments in Egypt. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri rises against the cliffs west of Thebes. Its terraces seem to emerge from the landscape itself. Long horizontal lines contrast with the towering cliffs behind them. It is a monument of extraordinary confidence. Yet after Hatshepsut died, some later rulers attempted to remove or obscure aspects of her memory. Statues were damaged. Names were altered or removed. The reasons remained debated, and the process was not simply an immediate personal hatred. Egyptian kingship had its own rules about succession, legitimacy, and historical memory. But the result was clear. A powerful woman's reign became less visible. For centuries, much of her story was hidden. And then archaeology gradually brought it back. Another ruler followed who would become one of Egypt's greatest military kings. Thutmose III. Under his reign, Egypt's influence expanded dramatically. Campaigns were launched into the Levant. The Egyptian army became a sophisticated fighting force. The empire received tribute. Egyptian authority reached far beyond the Nile Valley. The wealth generated by this expansion helped transform temples and royal monuments. The kingdom was at the height of its power. But history rarely moves in a straight line. And one of the strangest chapters in Egyptian history was about to begin. A pharaoh would challenge the religious traditions that had shaped Egypt for centuries. His name was Akhenaten. At the center of his religious transformation was the Aten, represented by the visible disk of the sun. Akhenaten elevated the Aten above the traditional gods. He moved the royal court away from Thebes. A new capital was established at a place now known as Amarna. The change was enormous. Traditional religious institutions were challenged. Old centers of power were disrupted. And Egyptian art changed. The royal family began appearing in unusually intimate scenes. Akhenaten, his wife Nefertiti, and their daughters could be shown together in ways that differed sharply from earlier royal representations. They embraced. They interacted with their children. The king's body was represented in a distinctive, sometimes exaggerated form. The artistic revolution reflected a deeper political and religious revolution. But it did not last. After Akhenaten's death, the traditional religious order gradually returned. The old gods regained their temples. The capital at Amarna was abandoned. And Akhenaten's memory became deeply uncomfortable for later rulers. His name was neglected. His monuments were dismantled or reused. His reign became an interruption in the official story. And then came a child, Tutankhamun. He was not the most powerful ruler Egypt ever produced. His reign was short. His political authority was limited by his age and by the officials surrounding him. But history has given him a fame that far exceeds his political achievements. The reason is simple: his tomb. More than 3,000 years after his death, an archaeologist named Howard Carter discovered it in the Valley of the Kings. The discovery was extraordinary. The tomb contained a vast collection of objects: chariots, furniture, weapons, jewelry, statues, ceremonial objects, and eventually the famous golden burial mask. The modern world was captivated. The boy king, whose reign had once been a relatively small chapter in Egyptian political history, suddenly became one of the most famous individuals of the ancient world. But Tutankhamun's story is also a reminder of something important. Archaeology does not preserve history evenly. Some kings built enormous monuments that were later destroyed. Some ordinary people left behind small letters or household objects. Some rulers were nearly erased. Others became famous because their tombs happened to survive. History is therefore partly the story of what remains. And what remains can surprise us. After Tutankhamun came rulers whose monuments were far more extensive. Among the most famous was Ramesses II. He ruled for decades. His name appears across Egypt. He built enormous monuments. He commissioned statues of himself. He celebrated military victories. And he cultivated an image of royal power that would survive long after his death. One of the most famous military events associated with his reign was the Battle of Kadesh. Egypt confronted the Hittite Empire. The battle became central to Ramesses' royal propaganda. Temple walls portrayed the pharaoh as a heroic warrior fighting almost alone against overwhelming forces. But the actual conflict was more complicated. The battle did not produce the absolute Egyptian triumph suggested by the monumental imagery. Eventually, Egypt and the Hittites reached a peace agreement. That agreement became one of the earliest known surviving international peace treaties. It tells us something about ancient politics. Even powerful kings eventually needed diplomacy. Empires could fight, but they also negotiated. And while kings fought over territory and prestige, ordinary Egyptians continued living lives that were far less dramatic. For most people, history was not written in battles. It was lived beside the river. A farmer might wake before sunrise. He might walk toward the fields. He would inspect the crops, repair tools, work with animals, carry grain, and return home at the end of the day. His world was shaped by seasons, by harvests, by taxes, by family, by local officials, and by the Nile. A craftsman lived differently. He might spend years learning to carve stone. Another worker might specialize in woodworking, another in metalworking, another in painting. Some artisans worked on royal monuments. Others created objects for ordinary households. Their hands left marks that survive today. Painted wall, a carved figure, a wooden box, piece of jewelry, a simple tool. These objects remind us that Egypt was not built only by pharaohs. It was built by millions of people whose names we will never know. People who planted, built, cooked, carried, sailed, wrote, prayed, loved, raised children, buried their parents, and eventually became ancestors themselves. The ancient Egyptian world was deeply religious. But religion was not a separate compartment of life. It was everywhere. The sun itself could be understood through divine imagery. The Nile was connected with fertility and renewal. Kingship had sacred meaning. Temples shaped economic life. Burials involved religious rituals. And the gods were woven into stories explaining the nature of existence. Ra traveled across the sky. Osiris became associated with death and regeneration. Isis represented motherhood, protection, and magical power. Horus was connected with kingship. Anubis guarded the dead and became associated with mummification and burial. Ammonius became one of the most powerful gods of the new kingdom. These were not simply characters in stories. They were part of a system through which Egyptians understood their world. And perhaps nowhere was that worldview more visible than in their treatment of death. To understand Egypt, we have to understand that death was not imagined as simple disappearance. The Egyptians believed that some form of existence continued. But continuing after death required preparation. The body mattered. The name mattered. The tomb mattered. The offerings mattered. The rituals mattered. A person's transition into the next world was not treated casually. Mummification developed as a way of preserving the body. The process became increasingly sophisticated over time. The body was treated carefully. It was wrapped, protected, placed within containers, and eventually surrounded by objects intended to support the deceased in the afterlife. For a wealthy person, a tomb might contain furniture, food, clothing, jewelry, tools, weapons, images, religious texts, scenes of gardens, scenes of rivers, scenes of servants. The tomb was imagined almost as an extension of life, a place where existence could continue. And this belief produced some of the most extraordinary art in human history. Inside tombs, artists painted scenes of everyday activity. Farmers harvesting grain, fishermen working along waterways, musicians performing, dancers moving, animals grazing, boats traveling. These images were not simply decoration. They could have a functional role in the afterlife. If the deceased needed food, perhaps an image of food could help provide it. If the deceased needed workers, images of servants could symbolically perform those tasks. The tomb therefore became a bridge between physical and spiritual existence. But the Egyptian afterlife was not always imagined as peaceful. The dead faced dangers. They needed knowledge. They needed protection. And eventually they faced judgment. The heart was central to this idea. In Egyptian belief, the heart could be weighed against the feather associated with Ma'at. If the heart was balanced, the deceased could continue. If it was burdened by wrongdoing, the consequences could be terrible. The imagery reveals an important Egyptian idea. Eternity was not simply a reward for being powerful. Moral order mattered. The universe had rules. Human beings were expected to live within those rules. and the king, above all, was expected to maintain them. This brings us back to the Nile, because the river was not only the source of agricultural life. The cycle itself became a metaphor. Water rises. The land disappears. Then the water retreats. The soil becomes fertile. Plants emerge. Life returns. The cycle repeats. Death and renewal were therefore not abstract ideas. They were visible every year. The landscape itself seemed to teach the Egyptians that endings could lead to beginnings. And perhaps this helped shape one of the most enduring civilizations on Earth. But even a civilization built around continuity cannot escape change. The new kingdom eventually weakened. Political authority became fragmented. Economic pressures increased. Foreign groups gained influence. The great imperial age gradually came to an end. Egypt entered another period of political instability. Libyan rulers gained power. Nubian kings eventually conquered Egypt. Assyrian armies invaded. Persian rulers took control. Again and again foreign powers arrived. And yet Egypt remained Egypt. Its temples continued. Its traditions survived. Its people continued to speak Egyptian languages. The Nile continued its annual cycle. The old gods continued to appear in religious art. The civilization adapted. Then another foreign conqueror arrived from the west. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Egypt. The Persian Empire had controlled Egypt, but Alexander's arrival transformed the political situation. He was welcomed by many Egyptians. He was recognized as pharaoh. And on the Mediterranean coast, he founded a city that would become one of the greatest intellectual centers of the ancient world, Alexandria. But that story belongs to another chapter. For now, the sun is setting over the Nile. The desert is cooling. And the monuments of the pharaohs are beginning to disappear into shadow. Thousands of years ago, another generation would have watched the same sunset. They would have seen the river turning gold. They would have heard boats moving through the water. They would have watched birds settling among the reeds. And perhaps they believed, as their ancestors had believed, that the world was still in balance. For tonight, let that ancient landscape remain quiet, because Egypt's story is far from over. The great empire will rise again. A forgotten queen will challenge tradition. A young king will become famous through a tomb. A warrior pharaoh will confront a rival empire. A strange religious revolution will briefly transform the kingdom. And eventually Egypt will face powers that it cannot defeat. But the Nile will remain, always moving, always returning, always carrying the memory of a civilization that believed it had discovered a way to make life, and even death, endure. And as the stars appear above the desert, the story continues. The sun disappears beyond the western desert, and for a moment the Nile becomes almost black beneath the evening sky. But ancient Egypt did not sleep when the sun went down. The night belonged to other worlds. Torches flickered along temple walls. Oil lamps glowed inside homes. Priests moved through sacred spaces. Families gathered around small fires. And above them, the stars appeared with a clarity that modern cities have almost forgotten. To the Egyptians, the night sky was not empty. It was part of the ordered universe. The stars moved. The moon changed. The sun disappeared and returned. Everything seemed to follow a pattern. And because the Egyptians valued order so deeply, they looked to the heavens for signs of that same eternal rhythm. The sky became a map. The stars became markers. The movement of celestial bodies helped establish calendars and measure time. The appearance of certain stars was connected with the coming of the Nile flood. The Egyptians observed the world carefully because survival depended upon observation. A farmer needed to know when to plant. A priest needed to know when ceremonies should take place. A government needed to organize taxes and labor. A sailor needed to understand the river and the seasons. The civilization that produced enormous temples and pyramids was also a civilization of practical observation. Its achievements were not created in isolation. They grew from generations of watching the river, watching the sky, watching animals, watching the seasons, watching death, and watching one another. This careful observation also shaped Egyptian medicine. Ancient Egyptian healers treated wounds, broken bones, burns, infections, and other illnesses. Some medical texts contain practical instructions that reveal considerable experience. They knew that certain injuries required particular treatments. They used bandages. They used mixtures made from plants and other substances. They sometimes recognized that an injury could have consequences elsewhere in the body. But medicine remained deeply connected with religion and magic. A treatment could involve physical ingredients and a spoken formula. The boundary between what we would now call medicine and spiritual practice was not the same as ours. For an ancient Egyptian, the world was interconnected. A wound was physical, but existence itself was also spiritual. Healing therefore could involve the body, the mind, the gods, and the unseen world at the same time. This way of thinking extended into everyday life. Even the simplest objects could carry meaning. Amulets were worn for protection. Small figures could represent gods. Images of animals could have religious significance. Jewelry could be decorative and symbolic at once. A necklace was not merely beautiful. It might also protect the person wearing it. A small carved figure might not simply be an ornament. It could have a role in burial rituals. The ancient world was filled with symbols, and Egypt was perhaps one of the most visually symbolic cultures ever created. Look closely at the walls of a temple and the images begin to tell stories. A king stands before a god. A god offers an object. A procession moves toward a sacred chamber. Enemies appear beneath the king's feet. Animals are shown in carefully chosen poses. Plants grow beside the river. Boats travel across water. The images are arranged according to rules. Egyptian art was not intended to reproduce reality exactly as a modern photograph would. It was designed to communicate. The human body might be represented using several viewpoints at once. The head shown from the side, the eye from the front, the shoulders broad, the legs positioned in profile. It looks unusual to modern eyes because the goal was not simply visual realism. The goal was clarity, to show the essential parts of a person, to make the identity unmistakable, to make the image function. The same principle appears in royal portraits. Pharaohs were usually represented as powerful, youthful, controlled, and idealized. Their faces often changed surprisingly little across different scenes. This was intentional. The king was not meant to look like an ordinary person caught in an unguarded moment. He represented stability, strength, continuity. The king's body became a symbol of the kingdom itself. But outside royal monuments, life could be much less idealized. Workers lived in crowded settlements. Families dealt with disease. Children died young. Farmers depended upon harvests. Craftsmen worked long hours. And even people who lived near royal centers could never be certain what the next year would bring. One of the best places to understand this ordinary world is the ancient workers' village of Deir el-Medina. The people who lived there were specialists. They were responsible for constructing and decorating royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Their work was secret. Their skills were highly valuable. And because they were part of a specialized workforce, some of their daily lives are unusually well documented. They left behind letters, notes, lists, records, complaints, and fragments of ordinary life. These records can feel strangely familiar. A worker might be absent. A delivery might be late. Someone might argue with a neighbor. A family might worry about food. A person might owe something to another. A husband and wife might disagree. The ancient Egyptians were not distant abstractions. They were people. They had tempers. They had friendships. They had debts. They had jokes. They had worries. They fell in love. They became jealous. They became sick. They mourned. And they dreamed. Sometimes the distance of thousands of years disappears in a single document. A complaint written on a piece of pottery can feel more intimate than a giant statue, because the statue shows how a civilization wanted to be remembered. The small note shows how someone actually lived. And perhaps nowhere is that contrast more powerful than in the story of Egyptian workers. For centuries, enormous monuments have made us imagine Egypt through pharaohs. But the monuments could only exist because ordinary people made them. Stonecutters, painters, carpenters, sailors, farmers, bakers, brewers, scribes, servants, soldiers, priests. Every one of them formed part of the machinery of civilization. The scribes were especially important. In a society without modern printing, digital storage, or mass literacy, writing was power. A trained scribe could record taxes, count grain, track workers, write letters, prepare legal documents, record religious texts, maintain inventories. Scribes could serve temples, royal institutions, or private individuals. Their profession required education, and education required time. A child destined to become a scribe entered a very different world from a child who would spend life working in the fields. The ability to read and write could change a person's social position. But most Egyptians were not literate. The surviving written record therefore represents only a fraction of ancient Egyptian society. This is another reason archaeology matters. A broken pot can reveal something that a royal inscription never would. A grain storage room can tell us about diet. Animal bones can reveal what people ate. Burial remains can reveal disease and physical labor. Tools can reveal how craftsmen worked. The smallest objects can reconstruct enormous parts of a lost world. And sometimes archaeology overturns old assumptions. For a long time, popular images of ancient Egypt focused almost entirely on monuments, pyramids, temples, tombs, mummies. But beneath the monuments was a complicated society. There were social classes. There were wealthy families. There were farmers. There were laborers. There were servants. There were soldiers. There were priests. There were officials. And there were people whose lives barely entered the historical record at all. Women occupied a particularly interesting position. Ancient Egyptian women could own property. They could inherit. They could enter legal agreements. They could sometimes initiate divorce. They could manage businesses. Their position was not identical to that of men, but it differed in important ways from many other ancient societies. Some women became extremely powerful. Queens could influence royal succession. Royal mothers could become politically important. And, in exceptional cases, women became pharaohs. Hatshepsut was the most famous example. But she was not the only woman to occupy the highest level of Egyptian kingship. Centuries later, another woman would take the throne. Her name was Cleopatra. But between Hatshepsut and Cleopatra lay more than 1,000 years of history. And during that time, Egypt would experience extraordinary changes. The new kingdom began to weaken. The great imperial system could no longer maintain the same level of control. Foreign powers became increasingly influential. Egypt sometimes controlled territories abroad. At other times, it struggled simply to control itself. The priesthood of Ammonius became enormously wealthy. Military commanders gained influence. Regional leaders competed for power. The old political balance began to shift. Eventually, Egypt entered a period when rulers from different backgrounds controlled the throne. Libyan dynasties appeared. Nubian rulers from Kush conquered Egypt. One of the most remarkable of these rulers was Pi. He marched north and eventually established control over Egypt. His successors ruled as pharaohs. To modernize, the idea of a kingdom being ruled by a dynasty from Nubia can seem surprising. But ancient Egypt was never isolated. The Nile connected Egypt with Nubia. Trade moved along the river. People traveled. Armies crossed borders. Cultures influenced each other. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia could involve trade, diplomacy, warfare, and cultural exchange. It was complicated, and it reminds us that ancient Africa was never a collection of isolated worlds. The Nile was a corridor connecting societies. Gold moved north. Goods moved south. People moved in both directions. Ideas traveled. Religious traditions influenced one another. Languages interacted, and political power shifted. Then came Assyria. The Assyrian Empire had become one of the most powerful states in the ancient Near East. Its armies were highly organized. Its kings expanded aggressively. Egypt eventually became involved in conflicts with Assyria and its regional rivals. The result was another reminder that geography could not protect Egypt forever. The Nile Valley might be sheltered by deserts, but the eastern Mediterranean connected Egypt to a wider world of competing empires. Assyrian armies could reach Egypt. Persian armies could reach Egypt. Greek armies could reach Egypt. And eventually Rome would reach Egypt. But before those later powers arrived, another great empire would take control: Persia. The Persian king Cambyses conquered Egypt in the 6th century BCE. Egypt became part of the Achaemenid Empire. Persian rulers adopted some Egyptian royal traditions. They presented themselves as pharaohs. They supported certain temples. They understood that ruling Egypt required more than simply occupying the land. It required legitimacy. This pattern would repeat again and again. Foreign rulers discovered that Egypt was not easy to govern through force alone. The culture was ancient. The religious institutions were powerful. The priesthood had deep roots. The population had its own traditions. And the Nile continued to determine everyday life. Even when the king spoke a foreign language, the river still flooded according to its own rhythm. Farmers still planted. Priests still performed rituals. Families still buried their dead. The ancient system proved remarkably resilient. Then, in 332 BCE, the balance changed again. Alexander entered Egypt. His arrival was part of a much larger conflict. The Persian Empire had been his target. Egypt was one province within that empire. But Alexander's conquest would have consequences far beyond military control. He was accepted as pharaoh. He visited the oracle of Ammonius at Siwa, and he founded Alexandria. The city was positioned on the Mediterranean coast. Its location was extraordinary. It could connect Egypt with the Greek world. It could connect the Nile with Mediterranean trade. And it could eventually become a center of scholarship unlike anything the ancient world had seen. After Alexander's death, his empire fragmented. Egypt fell under the control of one of his generals, Ptolemy. He established a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greek rulers. Yet they adopted Egyptian royal imagery. They appeared in Egyptian temples. They participated in traditional rituals. They presented themselves as pharaohs. At the same time, they built a distinctly Hellenistic world around Alexandria. 2 cultures now existed side by side, Greek and Egyptian. They interacted. They mixed. They competed. Sometimes they merged. The city of Alexandria became one of the most important places in the Mediterranean. This harbor was crowded with ships. Its streets carried merchants from distant lands. Its institutions attracted scholars. and somewhere within this world stood the Library of Alexandria. The exact history of the library is complicated, and later legends have often exaggerated its story. But there is no doubt that Alexandria became a major center of learning. Scholars studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, literature, geography, philosophy. Texts were collected, copied, translated, and debated. The city became a meeting point between traditions. Egyptian knowledge encountered Greek philosophy. Babylonian astronomical traditions could enter the scholarly world. Ideas traveled across languages, and the ancient Mediterranean became intellectually connected. One of the most famous scholars associated with Alexandria was Eratosthenes. He studied geography and calculated the Earth's circumference using observations of shadows. His estimate was remarkably close to the true value. The achievement demonstrates something important about ancient science. People thousands of years ago were capable of sophisticated mathematical reasoning. They did not have satellites. They did not have modern surveying equipment. They did not have digital calculators. Yet they could use geometry, observation, and logic to estimate the scale of the planet. Other Alexandrian scholars advanced mathematics and astronomy. Euclid's work on geometry became foundational. Archimedes, although associated primarily with Syracuse, belonged to the same broader Hellenistic intellectual world. Scientists and philosophers debated how the universe worked. And Egypt became part of a network of knowledge stretching across the Mediterranean and Near East. But beneath the intellectual life of Alexandria, the older Egypt continued. The temples remained. The priesthood remained. Traditional Egyptian religion remained. People continued to worship ancient gods. The Ptolemaic kings built temples in Egyptian styles. One of the most famous surviving examples stands at Edfu, the Temple of Horus. Its massive walls are covered with reliefs. Its inscriptions preserve ancient religious traditions. Its architecture shows how the old Egyptian world could survive under foreign rulers. The temple was built long after the pyramids, long after the great pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, long after the age of Ramesses. Yet the visual language remained recognizable. The gods still appeared. The kings still made offerings. The old myths remained alive. Egypt was changing, but it was also remembering. This tension would define the final centuries of ancient Egyptian history. The Ptolemaic dynasty became increasingly unstable. Royal families fought among themselves. Brothers competed. Sisters competed. Political factions formed. Alexandrian elites fought for influence. Egyptian populations sometimes resisted foreign rule. And the kingdom became increasingly dependent upon the rising power of Rome. Rome had begun as a city-state. Then it became a republic. Then a Mediterranean superpower. By the 1st century BCE, Roman influence was impossible to ignore. The Ptolemies needed Roman support. Roman politicians saw Egypt as strategically and economically important. And then, into this unstable world, came Cleopatra VII. She was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty. She was not ethnically Egyptian in the simple sense often imagined today. Her family was descended largely from Macedonian Greek rulers. But Cleopatra understood Egypt. She learned the Egyptian language, something unusual within her dynasty. She understood the importance of traditional religion. She presented herself as an Egyptian queen. She also understood politics. And she would need every bit of that knowledge. Because Egypt was entering one of the most dangerous political moments in its history. Cleopatra initially ruled alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. Their relationship deteriorated. The kingdom divided into rival factions. Then a Roman general arrived, Julius Caesar. Caesar had pursued his enemy Pompey into Egypt. Pompey was murdered shortly after arriving there. Caesar became involved in the Egyptian succession conflict. And Cleopatra made a decision that would become legendary. She found a way to meet Caesar privately. The later story of her being carried into his presence inside a rolled carpet may contain exaggeration. Ancient sources disagree in their details. But what is clear is that Cleopatra successfully established a political and personal relationship with Caesar. With Roman support, she regained the throne. The alliance changed Egypt's future. Cleopatra eventually had a son, Caesarion. She presented him as the son of Caesar. For Cleopatra, this was not simply a personal matter. It had enormous political implications. If Caesarion was recognized as Caesar's heir, Cleopatra could strengthen Egypt's position. But Rome itself was becoming unstable. Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE. The political order collapsed, and Cleopatra once again had to navigate a dangerous world. This time, her most important Roman ally would be Mark Antony. Antony controlled the eastern part of the Roman world. Cleopatra met him at Tarsus. Their relationship became both political and personal. Together, they formed an alliance. Egypt became deeply involved in Roman power struggles. But in Rome, another man was rising. Octavian, the future Augustus. He was Caesar's adopted heir, and he viewed Antony and Cleopatra as a threat. Propaganda transformed the conflict. Antony was portrayed as a man corrupted by an Eastern queen. Cleopatra was portrayed as dangerous, seductive, foreign, and ambitious. The Roman struggle became a battle of images as much as armies. Then came Actium. In 31 BCE, forces loyal to Octavian confronted the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra near the western coast of Greece. The battle was decisive. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated. They retreated to Egypt. But the end was approaching. Octavian invaded. Alexandria fell. Antony died. Cleopatra died soon afterward. The exact circumstances of her death remain uncertain. Later tradition says she used a venomous snake. But the evidence does not allow complete certainty. What we know is that Cleopatra was dead. Caesarion was killed, and the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt became a Roman province. For the first time in thousands of years, Egypt no longer had an independent pharaoh ruling from the Nile Valley. The old world had reached another turning point. But even now, Egypt did not disappear. Roman emperors presented themselves as pharaohs in Egyptian temples. Traditional religious practices continued. Egyptian gods remained worshipped. The temples remained active. The Nile continued to flood. The fields continued to grow. The language continued to evolve. And new religions slowly began entering the landscape. Christianity spread through Egypt. Alexandria became one of the most important centers of early Christian thought. Religious debates that would shape later Christianity took place there. Egyptian monasticism developed in the deserts. Men and women withdrew from cities and settlements to live lives devoted to prayer and discipline. The desert, which had once protected ancient Egypt, now became a landscape of spiritual retreat. The old gods gradually lost ground. Temples closed. Christian churches appeared. Ancient religious traditions survived for centuries, but eventually their public institutions weakened. The civilization that had worshipped Osiris, Isis, Horus, Ammonius, and countless other gods was entering a fundamentally different age. Yet even as the religious world changed, something astonishing remained. The monuments, the pyramids were still standing. The temples were still standing. The tombs were still buried beneath the sand. The hieroglyphs still covered walls. The ancient names still existed. But the ability to read those names would eventually disappear. That may be one of the strangest parts of Egypt's story. A civilization that cared so deeply about memory would one day become almost unreadable. For centuries, people could look directly at hieroglyphs and no longer understand what they said. The images survived. The language behind them became silent. Temple walls became mysterious landscapes of birds, snakes, eyes, hands, suns, animals, and strange symbols. Travelers wondered what they meant. Scholars proposed theories. Some interpretations were imaginative. Many were completely wrong. The ancient Egyptian written world had become locked. Then, in the late 18th century, a military expedition would uncover a clue that eventually changed everything. The French arrived in Egypt under Napoleon Bonaparte. Their campaign was military, but it also brought scholars and scientists. They documented monuments. They studied the landscape. They collected inscriptions. And near the town of Rashid, known in Europe as Rosetta, soldiers discovered a stone fragment containing inscriptions in different scripts. One of them was hieroglyphic. Another was Demotic, a later Egyptian script. The third was Greek. The stone would become famous as the Rosetta Stone. Its importance was not immediately understood in full. But because Greek could be read, scholars could compare the Greek text with the Egyptian scripts. The work was difficult, took years. The breakthrough came through the efforts of scholars including Thomas Young and Jean-François Champollion. Champollion eventually demonstrated that hieroglyphs could represent sounds as well as concepts. The ancient language began to speak again. Names that had been silent for centuries could be read. Royal inscriptions could be understood. Temple texts could be translated. The dead civilization began communicating with the modern world. And suddenly, Egypt was no longer only a landscape of mysterious monuments. It became a written civilization again. As people could speak across thousands of years. They could tell us what they believed, what they feared, who they worshipped, what they built, how they governed, how they buried their dead, how they imagined eternity, and perhaps most importantly, they could tell us that they had once been ordinary people. A farmer writing about a problem, a worker complaining about supplies, a priest recording a ritual, a king celebrating a victory, a grieving family preserving the memory of someone they loved. The stones had always been there, but now slowly they could be heard. And the more scholars learned, the more complicated ancient Egypt became. There was no single Egypt. There were many Egypts. Old Kingdom Egypt was not identical to New Kingdom Egypt. The religion changed. The political structure changed. The language changed. The borders changed. The people changed. Foreign cultures entered. Local traditions survived. The civilization was not frozen. It was alive for thousands of years. It adapted. It argued with itself. It reinvented itself. It remembered the past while constantly creating something new. That is perhaps why the civilization endured for so long. It was not strong because nothing changed. It was strong because it could absorb change without completely losing itself. And beneath every transformation was the same physical landscape. The Nile. The desert. The Mediterranean. The river continued flowing while dynasties rose and disappeared. Children became kings. Kings became ancestors. Temples expanded. Temples fell. Languages evolved. Empires conquered. Empires collapsed. The Nile remained. If we could stand beside it tonight, thousands of years ago, we might not recognize the names of the people around us. But we would recognize the basic rhythm of life. Someone preparing food. Someone repairing a boat. Someone carrying water. Someone walking home. Someone watching the sunset. Someone holding a child. Someone remembering the dead. The world would be ancient, but the people would still be human. And perhaps that is the quietest secret of ancient Egypt. Its greatest achievement was not simply the pyramid. Not the temple. Not the tomb. Not even the writing. It was continuity. Generation after generation, people returned to the river. They planted. They harvested. They built. They prayed. They buried their dead. They told stories. And then they passed the world to their children. The desert preserved their footprints. The sand covered their houses. The tombs sealed away their belongings. The river carried away countless names. But enough remained. Enough for us to reconstruct fragments of their lives. Enough for us to hear echoes. Enough for us to understand that the people of ancient Egypt were not trying to become ancient. They were simply trying to live. And perhaps that makes their story more haunting than any legend. Because eventually, every civilization becomes the past. Every palace becomes archaeology. Every ruler becomes a name carved into stone. Every voice becomes silence. Yet somewhere beneath the desert, a small object may still remain. A bead. A letter. A broken bowl. A child's toy. A piece of painted wood. Something touched by a human hand thousands of years ago, waiting quietly for someone to find it. And when that happens, a person who has been dead for 3,000 years can suddenly become present again. Not as a pharaoh, not as a monument, but as a human being. That is what archaeology gives us. Not immortality, but a brief second chance to be remembered. And for ancient Egypt, remembrance was everything. There is a strange silence that comes with standing among the ruins of ancient Egypt. The stones are enormous, but the silence around them feels even larger. A column that once carried the painted ceiling of a temple now stands beneath an open sky. A statue that once represented a living king has lost its face to time. A tomb that once echoed with prayers is dark and still. And yet, if we listen carefully, the ruins begin to suggest another world. A world of movement, of color, of music, of voices. Because ancient Egypt was never meant to be silent. Its temples were designed for ceremonies. Its tombs were filled with images of life. Its streets carried animals, merchants, soldiers, priests, farmers, and children. The Nile was crowded with boats, and the royal court was a place of ceremony, ambition, celebration, and danger. To understand the civilization fully, we have to move beyond the monuments. We have to imagine the ordinary day. The sun rises over the eastern horizon. Farmer wakes. Perhaps his home is built from mud brick, cool in the morning and warm by afternoon. He prepares food. Bread is a central part of the Egyptian diet. So is beer. Beer in ancient Egypt was not simply an alcoholic drink reserved for celebration. It could be an important source of calories and nutrition. Families ate grains, vegetables, dates, onions, fish, and other available foods. Wealthier households had access to greater variety. Meat was more expensive and less common for ordinary people, though it was certainly eaten. Along the river, fish could provide an important source of food. The Nile itself was therefore part of the kitchen. It was part of the economy, and it was part of the landscape of childhood. Children would have grown up around water. They would have watched boats move past. They would have seen fishermen pulling nets from the river. They would have watched birds gather among reeds. They would have learned very early that the river could provide almost everything. But the river could also be dangerous. Crocodiles lived in the Nile. Hippos could be aggressive. Boats could overturn. Floods could destroy property. The natural world was not simply beautiful. It was unpredictable. Ancient Egyptians understood this better than most. Their religious world reflected both the generosity and danger of nature. The gods could protect. The gods could punish. The same river that brought fertile soil could also bring disaster. The same sun that gave life could burn the fields. The desert could preserve a body for thousands of years, but it could also kill a traveler who lost the path. The ancient Egyptian worldview therefore contained both optimism and fear. Life was valuable because it was fragile. And perhaps that is one reason Egyptian art so often celebrates food, family, music, and abundance. The tombs show gardens, boats, banquets, animals, dancing. The images suggest a desire to continue living, even after death. The Egyptian afterlife was not imagined as a completely different existence. It often resembled an idealized version of the world people already knew. The deceased could sail, eat, drink, meet loved ones, work in fields, enjoy gardens. But reaching that world required preparation. The body had to be preserved. The tomb had to be equipped. Rituals had to be performed. The correct words mattered. And the person's name needed to remain alive. This is why Egyptian funerary culture became so elaborate. But beneath all the rituals was a simple human emotion. Fear of disappearance. The fear that one day no one would remember you. That fear is not uniquely Egyptian. It belongs to every civilization. But Egypt built an entire culture around confronting it. The pyramids were enormous attempts to defeat time. The tomb paintings were attempts to preserve life. The inscriptions were attempts to preserve names. The mummification process was an attempt to preserve bodies. And the stories of the gods provided a framework in which death could become transformation. One of the most important stories concerned Osiris. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris was a king who was killed by his brother Seth. His body was dismembered and scattered. Isis, his wife, searched for him. She recovered the pieces and helped restore him. Osiris then became associated with the realm of the dead. The story was powerful because it connected death with renewal. Person could die. But death did not necessarily mean the end. The cycle of Osiris mirrored the cycles Egyptians saw around them. The Nile disappeared into its flood and returned. Seeds disappeared beneath the earth and emerged as plants. The sun disappeared each evening and returned each morning. The dead could therefore be imagined as entering another stage rather than simply vanishing. But ancient Egyptian religion was not a single unchanging system. Different gods became more important at different times. Different cities had different religious traditions. Local gods could merge. One god could absorb characteristics of another. Names and forms could change. The religious world was constantly evolving. This complexity is one reason Egyptian mythology can be difficult to summarize. There was no single sacred book equivalent to a modern scripture that controlled every belief. Instead, traditions accumulated over centuries. Priests developed interpretations. Stories changed. Local customs survived. Kings promoted particular gods. Political power influenced religious importance. And ordinary people developed their own practices. At the heart of this system stood the temple. To modernize, an Egyptian temple can look like a public monument. But its function was different. The deepest parts of a major temple were not ordinary public spaces. They were sacred. The temple was understood as a dwelling place for the god. A cult statue represented the divine presence. Priests performed rituals. Food and other offerings were presented. The temple could own land, could employ workers, could control wealth, could become a major economic institution. This created enormous power. During the New Kingdom, the temple of Ammonius at Karnak became extraordinarily wealthy. Its estates extended across large areas. Its workforce included many people. Its priests became influential. The relationship between royal authority and religious institutions was therefore complicated. A pharaoh could be the supreme political figure, but the temples possessed resources of their own. This tension became particularly important during periods of political weakness, and it helps explain why religious reform could also be political reform. Akhenaten's transformation was not simply a change in personal belief. By elevating the Aten and weakening the traditional priesthoods, he disrupted established institutions. The new capital at Amarna became the center of this experiment. But when Akhenaten died, the old system returned. His successor, Tutankhamun, restored traditional religious practices. The abandoned city of Amarna became a symbol of a failed revolution. Today, the ruins of Amarna are haunting. Unlike the great ceremonial centers that continued for centuries, Amarna was occupied for only a relatively short period. The city was built quickly. Then it was abandoned. Its remains preserve a brief moment when Egypt attempted to reinvent itself. And sometimes the short-lived cities tell us as much as the great enduring ones. They show how quickly political decisions can reshape a landscape. But they also show how quickly that landscape can be erased. A city can rise because a ruler wants it, and disappear because the next ruler does not. This happened repeatedly throughout history. Egypt's rulers understood the importance of place. Capital cities mattered. Temples mattered. Tombs mattered. Being buried in the right place could connect a king to his ancestors. Being remembered in the right temple could reinforce legitimacy. And being erased from the wrong monument could weaken memory. The Egyptians therefore treated names with extraordinary seriousness. The name was not merely a label. It was part of the person's continued existence. This helps explain the practice later called damnatio memoriae by historians. When a ruler became politically unacceptable, later authorities might damage images, remove names, or alter inscriptions. But memory is difficult to control. Even when a name was erased, fragments could survive. Archaeologists could reconstruct missing pieces. A damaged statue could be identified. A forgotten queen could return to history. Hatshepsut is one of the clearest examples. For centuries, the story of her reign was obscured, but modern archaeology gradually reconstructed it. Her monuments revealed a ruler who had exercised enormous authority. Her expedition to Punt showed the importance of trade. Her temples showed architectural ambition. Her inscriptions showed how she presented her legitimacy. She had not simply occupied a throne. She had constructed an argument for why she deserved to rule. That was essential in ancient Egypt. Kingship was inherited, but inheritance alone did not guarantee acceptance. A ruler needed divine legitimacy, military strength, political support, and control of resources. The crown could be worn by one person, but power depended on thousands. Officials managed provinces. Scribes managed records. Priests managed temples. Military commanders managed soldiers. Local leaders managed communities. Farmers produced food. Craftsmen produced tools and monuments. Sailors moved goods. The entire kingdom functioned through networks, and those networks could fail. One of the greatest challenges was communication. Egypt was long and narrow. The Nile made travel possible, but information still took time to move. A message from the south could take days or longer to reach the north. A military campaign could be far from the capital. A regional governor might gain influence before the central government could respond. This is one reason political fragmentation repeatedly occurred. Centralized authority was powerful, but maintaining it across a long river valley required constant effort. The pharaoh was at the top of the system, but the pharaoh could not personally supervise every field, temple, ship, and workshop. The bureaucracy made the state possible, and the bureaucracy depended upon writing. This is why scribes mattered so much. A single document could record hundreds of details. How much grain was stored, how many workers were present, how much material had been delivered, which official had received what, who owed taxes, who had been paid. The ancient state was, in part, a system of information, and once writing existed, memory became external. The government no longer had to depend entirely on human recollection. A record could survive, but records were not neutral. Officials decided what to record. Kings decided what to celebrate. Temple priests decided what to preserve, and later rulers could alter earlier records. The written past was therefore shaped by power. This is something modern historians constantly have to remember. If most surviving texts come from kings and priests, then the historical record naturally reflects their priorities. The farmer who spent 40 years working in a field may have left no biography. The servant who raised 5 children may have left no written account. The soldier who died far from home may be remembered only through a grave. The woman who ran a household may have disappeared almost completely from the record. Yet these people made up the civilization. Archaeology helps bring them back. Their houses, their tools, their bones, their food remains, their pottery, their children's toys, their footprints. All of these fragments help reconstruct ordinary life. And sometimes a tiny object can reveal an enormous truth. A simple hair comb can show how people cared for themselves. A cosmetic container can reveal beauty practices. A child's toy can reveal what children played with. A medical instrument can reveal how injuries were treated. A fishing hook can reveal diet. A sandal can reveal craftsmanship. The great monuments tell us what Egypt could build. The small objects tell us how Egypt lived. Together, they create a fuller picture. And the picture is surprisingly human. Egyptians cared about appearance. They used cosmetics. They wore jewelry. They styled their hair. They used oils and perfumes. They decorated clothing. They valued cleanliness. Elite households could employ servants responsible for personal care. But ordinary people also found ways to maintain appearance with whatever resources were available. Beauty was not a modern invention. Neither was fashion. Clothing varied according to wealth, occupation, gender, and period. Linen was especially important. Egypt's climate made lightweight clothing practical. Wealthier people could wear finer fabrics. Jewelry could indicate status. Gold was highly valued. It did not tarnish easily. Its color connected it with the sun and perhaps with ideas of divine permanence. Gold was therefore especially appropriate for royal and funerary objects. The famous burial equipment of Tutankhamun gives only one glimpse of this wealth. But gold was not available equally to everyone. For ordinary Egyptians, jewelry could be made from less expensive materials. Colored stones, faience, copper, glass. The desire for beauty crossed social boundaries. The materials did not. The same was true of housing. A wealthy household might have multiple rooms around courtyards. There could be storage spaces, work areas, gardens, servants' quarters. Ordinary homes were smaller, but even a modest house was a center of family life. The family was one of the most important institutions in Egyptian society. Marriage was generally practical but could also involve affection. Letters reveal emotional relationships. Parents worried about children. Children could inherit property. Family members cared for aging relatives. Death did not erase family bonds. Funerary rituals were partly about preserving those bonds. The dead continued to receive offerings. Their names were spoken. Their tombs were visited. Their images remained. This created an unusual relationship between the living and the dead. The dead were gone, but they were not supposed to become forgotten. A tomb could be visited by descendants. Offerings could be brought. Prayers could be spoken. The boundary between the living and the dead was therefore permeable. The dead remained part of the family, and this may help explain why tomb robbery was considered such a terrible crime. A tomb was not merely a storage place for valuables. It was the foundation of someone's eternal existence. But tombs contained valuables, and that created a dangerous temptation. Ancient Egypt suffered from tomb robbery for thousands of years. Even royal tombs were not always safe. Burial goods could be extremely valuable. Gold, jewelry, precious stones, furniture, weapons. The objects were placed in tombs to serve the dead, but robbers saw them as wealth. Some tombs were robbed shortly after burial. Others were robbed centuries later. Priests and officials sometimes attempted to protect royal mummies by moving them. This is why some famous royal mummies were found together in hidden caches. The bodies had been relocated from their original tombs. The goal was protection. But even then, history was not finished with them. Thousands of years later, archaeologists would rediscover them. And suddenly the physical remains of famous kings became evidence for modern science. Their bones could be examined. Their teeth could be studied. Their injuries could be analyzed. Their age could be estimated. Disease could sometimes be identified. Technology allowed modern researchers to look beneath the wrappings without destroying them. Computed tomography could reveal details hidden for millennia. The mummy stopped being merely a relic. It became a biological record. A person who had lived thousands of years ago could tell us something about their health, diet, injuries, and age at death. But mummies also create ethical questions. These were once human beings. They had families. They had names. They had beliefs about what should happen to their bodies. Modern museums and researchers therefore face difficult questions about display, ownership, study, and respect. The ancient Egyptians themselves would probably have found the idea of opening royal tombs centuries later deeply disturbing. Their entire funerary system was designed around protection. And yet the very things intended to preserve the dead have made them subjects of modern curiosity. The mummy has become one of the most famous images associated with Egypt. But the reality of mummification was more complex than the popular image. Not everyone was preserved in the same way. Methods varied according to wealth and period. The most elaborate process was expensive. It required skilled specialists. The body was treated carefully. Certain internal organs were removed and preserved separately. The body was dried using natron. Then it was wrapped in layers of linen. Amulets could be placed among the wrappings. The final result was not intended to look frightening. It was intended to preserve the deceased. The face could be covered by a mask. The body could be placed inside one or more coffins. For a king, the burial might include an elaborate sequence of protective objects. But the purpose was the same: to maintain identity, to preserve existence, and to prepare the deceased for eternity. The ancient Egyptians did not simply ask what happens after death. They spent thousands of years developing systems for answering the question. And perhaps the most famous of these systems involved the judgment of the heart. Imagine the scene. The deceased stands before divine judges. The heart is placed on one side of a balance. On the other side is the feather of Ma'at. The balance must remain true. If the deceased has lived properly, the heart passes. If it is weighed down by wrongdoing, another fate awaits. The creature often shown nearby is Ammit, a composite being associated with devouring the hearts of those who failed the judgment. The imagery is powerful because it transforms morality into something measurable. Your life leaves weight. Your actions matter. The universe remembers. That idea appears again and again in Egyptian thought. Ma'at is not simply a goddess or abstract principle. It is the structure that allows the world to function. Without Ma'at, there is chaos. The king must maintain it. Individuals must live within it. The gods uphold it. And death does not erase responsibility. The afterlife therefore reflects the same moral order as the living world. This is one reason Egyptian tomb texts can feel so intense. They are not only instructions. They are defenses. The deceased must know the correct names, the correct spells, the correct pathways, the correct rituals. Knowledge itself becomes protection. The famous collection now called the Book of the Dead was not a single book in the modern sense. It was a collection of funerary spells and texts that could be selected and arranged for particular burials. Some versions were written on papyrus. Others appeared on tomb walls or coffins. They were intended to help the deceased navigate the dangers of the afterlife. Different periods used different traditions. The texts changed. The illustrations changed. But the underlying concern remained. How do you survive death? How do you reach the next world? How do you remain yourself? These questions were not philosophical luxuries. They were central to Egyptian culture. And they shaped architecture. They shaped art. They shaped writing. They shaped religion. They shaped family rituals. They shaped the economy. They shaped the way Egyptians thought about time. Time itself could be understood in two ways. There was ordinary time. Days passed. Seasons changed. Kings grew old. Children became adults. But there was also eternal time. The repeated cycles of the sun, the stars, the gods, the afterlife, the eternal repetition of order. Egyptian monuments were designed to connect these two forms of time. A tomb existed in the present, but its purpose extended into eternity. A king died, but his name remained. A temple was built during one reign, but rituals could continue for centuries. The past was therefore not simply behind them. It remained active. Ancestors mattered. Old kings mattered. Old gods mattered. Ancient traditions could be revived. This respect for the past was one of Egypt's greatest strengths. But it could also become a source of resistance to change. When Akhenaten attempted to transform religion, the old order eventually returned. When foreign rulers arrived, they often adopted Egyptian traditions. When Greek kings ruled, they built Egyptian temples. When Roman emperors ruled, they appeared in Pharaoh's costume on temple walls. Egypt absorbed conquerors more often than conquerors erased Egypt. But each new layer changed the civilization. By the Roman period, Egypt was no longer the Egypt of the pyramids. The language had changed. The political system had changed. Cities had changed. Religion was changing. Yet the old symbols still survived. The Nile still shaped agriculture. The desert still protected ancient sites. The temples still carried inscriptions. And the pyramids still stood. That is the strange power of Egypt. A civilization can transform without completely disappearing. The old world can survive inside the new. Even after Christianity spread through Egypt, elements of ancient Egyptian culture continued in unexpected ways. The Egyptian language evolved. Coptic developed from earlier Egyptian forms and became the language of Egyptian Christians. Some older traditions were transformed rather than simply erased. Places remained sacred. Symbols changed meaning. Buildings were reused. Stone was taken from old monuments and incorporated into new structures. History became layered. One civilization literally built on top of another. This is why Egyptian archaeology can feel like walking through time. A Roman inscription may appear on a wall built in an Egyptian architectural style. A Christian building may incorporate ancient stone. A modern village may stand near a temple that was already ancient when Rome was young. The landscape holds multiple histories at once. And sometimes those histories contradict each other. A king celebrates a victory on one wall. Archaeological evidence suggests the battle was less decisive. A later ruler erases a predecessor. The erased name survives elsewhere. A tomb is described as intact. A hidden chamber reveals evidence of earlier disturbance. History is rarely as clean as the monuments suggest. The Egyptians understood propaganda. So did the Greeks. So did the Romans. So do modern governments. Every civilization creates stories about itself. The historian's task is to look beneath those stories, to compare inscriptions, archaeology, environmental evidence, human remains, foreign accounts, and material culture. Ancient Egypt is especially rewarding because so much evidence survives. The dry climate preserved organic material that would disappear elsewhere. Papyrus survived. Wood survived. Textiles survived. Food remains survived. Bodies survived. Paint survived. The desert became a time capsule. But preservation also creates an illusion. Because Egypt preserved so much, it can appear as though we know everything. We do not. There are enormous gaps. Thousands of documents are lost. Many settlements remain buried. Many tombs have been robbed. Many ancient Egyptian texts are incomplete. Some words remain uncertain. Some historical events are still debated. The story is not finished. Every excavation can change what we thought we knew. A new tomb can reveal a forgotten official. A new inscription can clarify a dynasty. A new scientific test can challenge an old identification. Ancient Egypt is therefore not a closed book. It is an unfinished conversation. And perhaps that is why people continue returning to it. Not simply because the pyramids are beautiful. Not simply because the mummies are mysterious. But because Egypt gives us an unusually long view of human civilization. We can watch a society emerge from early settlements. We can watch kingship develop. We can see bureaucracy expand. We can see monumental architecture transform. We can see religion change. We can see foreign empires arrive. We can see languages evolve. We can see one civilization survive for thousands of years while constantly changing shape. And through all of it, individual lives appear briefly. A name on a tomb. A letter on papyrus. A face carved in stone. A child's footprint. A worker's complaint. A mother's prayer. A king's boast. Priest's ritual. Then silence. The people are gone. But the evidence remains. And the evidence allows us to imagine them. Perhaps that is the closest thing archaeology offers to time travel. Not seeing the past exactly as it was. We can never do that. But catching glimpses. A sound imagined from a written word. A face reconstructed from a statue. A meal inferred from a kitchen. A journey traced through a shipping record. A burial understood through objects. A life reconstructed from fragments. Ancient Egypt survives in fragments. And yet, somehow, the fragments are enough to make the civilization feel alive. Tonight, as the Nile moves beneath the stars, imagine a small boat traveling north. Its wooden hull rises and falls gently. A lantern glows near the stern. The person steering watches the river. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness, a temple waits. Its columns are painted. Its walls are covered in images. Its priests have prepared offerings. The world is quiet. The river carries the boat forward. And beyond the river lies the desert. Beyond the desert lies the unknown. But the traveler knows the route. He has done this before. His ancestors did it before him. And perhaps his children will do it after him. This is how civilizations endure. Not only through kings, through repetition, through habits, through stories, through skills passed from one generation to the next. A father teaches a son how to steer. A mother teaches a daughter how to prepare food. A craftsman teaches an apprentice how to carve stone. A priest teaches another priest the words of a ritual. A scribe teaches a child how to form a sign. The civilization continues because knowledge moves. And as long as knowledge moves, the past remains alive. But knowledge can also be lost. A language can fall silent. A temple can close. A dynasty can disappear. A city can be abandoned. And when that happens, centuries may pass before anyone understands what was lost. Egypt came dangerously close to that silence. The ancient world changed. Rome changed. Christianity transformed the religious landscape. The old temples eventually fell quiet. Sand covered roads. Floods altered the river. Buildings collapsed. Stone was reused. Names became unreadable. The people who once spoke the language of the pharaohs became ancestors to people living in a completely different world. Yet the monuments remained. They waited. And eventually modern archaeology arrived. The first explorers often approached Egypt with a mixture of fascination and misunderstanding. Some searched for biblical connections. Others searched for treasure. Some collected artifacts. Others destroyed contexts without realizing how much information they were losing. Archaeology itself had to develop. The idea that an artifact is valuable not only because of what it is, but because of where it was found, became increasingly important. A golden object removed from a tomb is valuable. But the same object documented in its original position can reveal much more. Can tell us how the burial was arranged. Who was buried there? What rituals were performed? What objects were considered important? What relationships existed between objects? Context transforms objects into evidence. And modern archaeology increasingly depends upon careful recording. Excavations became slower, more systematic, more scientific. Human remains were treated as evidence rather than simply curiosities. Seeds were analyzed. Pollen was studied. Residues inside pottery were examined. Pigments were identified. Wood was dated. Stone sources were traced. Technology allowed researchers to investigate without destroying. The ancient world became visible through multiple disciplines: archaeology, history, linguistics, chemistry, biology, astronomy, geology. Every field could contribute something, and the picture became more complex. For example, the pyramids could be studied not only as architecture. They could be studied through quarrying logistics, tool marks, worker settlements, food remains, transport routes, geology, mathematics, astronomical orientation. The more evidence we gather, the less mysterious the construction becomes. But strangely, understanding the engineering does not make the pyramids less impressive. It makes them more human. Every stone represents planning. Every alignment represents measurement. Every surviving surface represents labor. Every surviving inscription represents an attempt to communicate across time. The wonder is not that aliens built the pyramids. The wonder is that human beings did. People with simple tools. People working under a brutal sun. People who did not know what their descendants would become. People who simply wanted to create something that would endure. And perhaps they succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. Because tonight, more than 4,000 years after the Great Pyramid was built, people still look at it. Still wonder. Still ask how it was constructed. Still ask why it was built. Still debate its purpose. Still stand beneath it in awe. The king who ordered it has been dead for millennia. The civilization that built it has changed beyond recognition. But the monument remains. The ancient Egyptian dream of permanence became, in one sense, reality. Not eternal. Nothing is truly eternal, but extraordinarily long. Long enough for us to see it. Long enough for us to ask questions. Long enough for a civilization that vanished from political power to become one of the most recognizable cultures on Earth. And perhaps the greatest irony is this: the Egyptians spent thousands of years trying to preserve themselves from forgetting. They did not know our language. They did not know our technology. They did not know our cities. They did not know our world. But somehow they succeeded. We remember them. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough. We remember their kings, their gods, their temples, their farmers, their scribes, their artists, their children, their dead. And somewhere in that enormous distance between their world and ours, a fragile connection remains. A line of memory, a river of time. And tonight we follow that river a little farther. The river continues north. For thousands of years it carried more than water. Carried people. Carried food. Carried stone. Carried messages. Carried armies. And it carried the memory of Egypt itself. From the highlands of the south, the Nile moved through a landscape that seemed almost impossible to understand. On one side, green fields. On the other, endless desert. Between them, a narrow strip of life. This contrast was the foundation of Egyptian civilization. The ancient Egyptians called their fertile land something very different from the desert beyond it. The Black Land. And the Red Land. The Black Land was the fertile valley, darkened by the rich soil left behind by the river. The Red Land was the desert. One gave life. The other threatened it. Yet the desert was not useless. Provided stone, minerals, salt, gold, routes into distant regions, and, perhaps most importantly, protection. The desert made large-scale invasion more difficult. It helped Egypt develop a distinctive identity. But Egypt was never completely isolated. To the west lay Libya. To the south lay Nubia. To the northeast lay the Sinai and the wider Near East. And across the Mediterranean were societies that would eventually become deeply connected with Egypt. Trade routes carried goods and ideas. Egyptian merchants could encounter people speaking languages they did not understand. Foreign objects entered Egyptian settlements. Foreign soldiers entered Egyptian armies. Foreign gods sometimes entered Egyptian religious life. The civilization was constantly connected to a larger world. One of the most important connections was with the land of Punt. Egyptian records describe expeditions there, especially during the reign of Hatshepsut. The exact location of Punt remains debated, but it was somewhere in the region of the southern Red Sea, probably involving parts of the Horn of Africa and perhaps southern Arabia. The expeditions returned with valuable goods: frankincense, myrrh, ebony, gold, animals, and other exotic products. The walls at Deir el-Bahri preserve images of this expedition. Trees are shown. Animals are shown. Foreign people are shown. Ships are shown. The scenes are more than decoration. They are evidence of an ancient world connected by maritime trade. The Egyptians were not simply building monuments in isolation. They were participating in international commerce. And trade could transform societies. When merchants brought foreign goods into Egypt, those objects became symbols of wealth. Luxury materials could be used by elites. Rare woods became furniture. Precious stones became jewelry. Fragrant resins became part of religious rituals. Gold became decoration. The movement of goods created wealth. But it also created inequality. The more powerful a household became, the more access it had to luxury. And the more luxury surrounded the elite, the more visible the difference between classes became. This was not unique to Egypt. Every large civilization develops hierarchies. But Egypt's hierarchy was reinforced by its religious and political system. At the top stood the pharaoh. Below him were the highest officials, priests, military commanders, and wealthy families. Then came scribes, craftsmen, merchants, soldiers, and other specialized workers. Most people were farmers. Their labor fed the entire system. The fields surrounding the Nile were therefore more than farmland. They were the economic foundation of the state. A successful harvest could support temples, armies, construction projects, and royal households. A poor harvest could create shortages. And repeated shortages could become political crises. The pharaoh was expected to maintain order. If crops failed, people could question whether the king still had divine favor. This connection between nature and kingship was fundamental. The ruler was not merely a politician. He was responsible symbolically and practically for maintaining Ma'at. If the world became chaotic, the king's authority could be threatened. That is why royal inscriptions so often emphasize prosperity, order, victory, and abundance. The king's success was presented as the kingdom's success. But behind the ideal was a more complicated reality. There were rebellions. There were civil wars. There were famines. There were corrupt officials. There were succession disputes. The ancient Egyptians experienced all the instability that other human societies experience. The difference is that their monuments often hide it. A temple wall can show the king standing victorious over his enemies. It rarely shows the fear of ordinary people during a political crisis. A royal inscription can describe endless prosperity. A household letter can reveal hunger. Both are historical evidence. And sometimes the quieter evidence is more revealing. One of the most important discoveries in Egyptian archaeology has been the recognition that workers who built royal monuments were not necessarily the enslaved masses imagined by popular culture. The evidence from places such as Giza suggests organized labor forces with food supplies, housing, medical care, and systems of administration. This does not mean ancient Egyptian labor was gentle or equal. It was not. The state could demand enormous amounts of labor. People could be compelled to work. Social inequality was real. But the image of endless lines of chained slaves dragging every pyramid stone is far too simple. The pyramids were products of organization. Workers had to be fed. Tools had to be produced. Stone had to be quarried. Transport had to be coordinated. Supervisors had to manage teams. Housing had to be arranged. The project required an enormous administrative system. The monument was therefore not only an architectural achievement. It was an achievement of government. The pyramid revealed what a centralized state could accomplish. A ruler who could command tens of thousands of workers, move millions of stone blocks, and maintain a project over decades possessed extraordinary organizational power. And that power depended on agriculture. Without the harvest, there was no surplus. Without surplus, there was no large specialized workforce. Without specialized workers, there was no monumental construction on such a scale. The pyramid therefore began in the field. A farmer planting grain was part of the same system that eventually produced a royal tomb. This is one of the most important lessons of ancient history. Great monuments are built by ordinary economies. Behind every palace is a supply chain. Behind every army is a food system. Behind every temple is a network of workers. Behind every king is an enormous number of people whose names may never survive. The ancient Egyptians understood this. Their administration was detailed. They recorded deliveries. They measured grain. They counted animals. They tracked labor. They organized transportation. The bureaucracy was immense. And bureaucracy creates paper. Or, in Egypt's case, papyrus. Papyrus grew abundantly along the Nile. Its fibers could be processed into writing material. It became one of the most important technologies in Egyptian civilization. Writing on papyrus allowed information to travel. A document could be carried on a boat. A letter could be sent to another town. A record could be stored. A religious text could be copied. A government order could be distributed. Papyrus therefore helped turn the Nile into a communication network. But writing was fragile. Papyrus could decay. Fires could destroy archives. Water could erase ink. Political upheaval could scatter collections. That is why so much ancient writing has disappeared. The documents that survive are often accidents of preservation. Some survived because they were buried in dry desert conditions. Some survived because they were sealed in tombs. Some survived because they were thrown into rubbish dumps. Others survived because later generations reused them. A document can disappear from history simply because it was stored in the wrong place. This means the surviving record is incomplete. There may have been entire libraries whose contents vanished without leaving a trace. There may have been stories we will never know. There may have been people whose lives were never recorded. History is therefore not simply the study of what happened. It is also the study of what survived. And what survived is rarely random. Power influences preservation. Stone lasts longer than wood. Royal monuments last longer than peasant houses. Temples last longer than market stalls. Tombs last longer than ordinary homes. So when we imagine ancient Egypt, we are naturally drawn toward monumental remains. But monuments represent only a small part of the ancient world. Most Egyptians never lived inside a temple. They lived in houses. They worked in fields. They raised children. They bought food. They repaired tools. They argued. They celebrated. They grew old. And they died. The ordinary village was the real foundation of Egypt. Imagine such a village at dawn. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Donkeys move through narrow paths. Children run between houses. A woman carries a basket. A man prepares a fishing net. Potter works clay. Someone sweeps dust from the floor. A dog waits near a doorway. The river glitters beyond the fields. Nothing about this scene looks monumental. And yet this was where Egypt existed. Not in stone. In routine. Civilizations are often remembered through extraordinary events. Wars. Kings. Disasters. Revolutions. But most of history is ordinary. Person wakes. Works. Eats. Sleeps. Repeats. The ancient Egyptians lived through thousands of such days. Their civilization lasted because ordinary life continued even when kings changed. A pharaoh could die. A dynasty could fall. A foreign army could arrive. But the farmer still needed to plant. The baker still needed to bake. The boatman still needed to cross the river. The system continued. This resilience was remarkable. Even during political collapse, local traditions survived. The gods survived. The language survived. The agricultural cycle survived. And eventually, a new political order could emerge from the old. The Middle Kingdom is an example of such recovery. After the fragmentation of the First Intermediate Period, Egypt was reunified. The Middle Kingdom rulers strengthened central authority. They expanded irrigation. They built monuments. They developed literature. They secured borders. They promoted a renewed vision of kingship. Some of the finest surviving Egyptian literature comes from this period. Stories and teachings reveal a culture interested not only in gods and kings, but in morality, politics, and human behavior. One famous tradition, the story often called the Tale of Sinew, follows a man who leaves Egypt and lives abroad before eventually returning. This power comes partly from its emotional themes: fear, exile, identity, longing for home, the desire to be buried in one's homeland. These emotions are recognizable even after thousands of years. Sinew is not a pharaoh. He is not a god. He is a person caught in political events. And his story reminds us that ancient literature could explore deeply human questions. What does it mean to belong somewhere? What happens when you leave? Can you return? Where is home? What will happen to you after death? These questions remain with us. Another important literary tradition involved wisdom. Texts offered advice about behavior, how to speak, how to treat others, how to deal with authority, how to behave in society. They reveal a culture deeply concerned with social order. But social order could become oppressive. The same system that provided stability could demand obedience. A peasant might have little control over taxation. A worker might be required to complete state labor. A soldier might be sent far from home. A servant might have limited freedom. Ancient Egypt was not a peaceful paradise. It was a hierarchical society. Its beauty should not erase its inequalities. And yet, the ancient world cannot be judged entirely through modern categories either. People lived according to assumptions very different from ours. Their understanding of freedom, duty, family, religion, and government was shaped by their own time. The challenge for historians is to understand them without romanticizing them or reducing them to stereotypes. That becomes especially important when studying ancient warfare. Egyptian armies fought for territory, resources, and security. Soldiers used bows, spears, axes, shields. Later, chariots became an important weapon. The horse-drawn chariot transformed warfare in the Near East. It allowed elite warriors to move quickly across open terrain. During the New Kingdom, Egypt developed powerful chariot forces. The image of the pharaoh charging into battle became part of royal propaganda. Ramesses II is famous for the Battle of Kadesh. The conflict against the Hittite Empire was presented in Egyptian inscriptions as a dramatic royal victory. But the actual outcome appears to have been more complicated. The battle did not produce the simple victory portrayed by the king. Eventually, Egypt and the Hittites reached a peace agreement. That treaty became one of the earliest known international peace treaties. It is another reminder that diplomacy could be as important as warfare. The ancient world was not permanently at war. Kings negotiated. They exchanged gifts. They arranged marriages. They sent envoys. They made treaties. International politics existed long before modern diplomacy, and Egypt was one of its major participants. Royal marriages could strengthen alliances. Foreign princesses could enter Egyptian courts. Egyptian princesses were generally less commonly sent abroad in royal marriages, reflecting different political traditions. The exchange of gifts could communicate status. Gold, jewelry, animals, luxury goods. Letters could travel between courts. The rulers of Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and other regions were part of an international elite. They knew one another's names. They knew one another's ambitions. They complained about delayed gifts. They demanded respect. They negotiated marriages. They threatened war. Their correspondence reveals a surprisingly familiar political world. Kings could be impatient. They could be suspicious. They could be flattering. They could be angry. And they understood that diplomacy was performance. A king's message was never just a message. It represented his status. The wrong wording could be insulting. The wrong gift could be interpreted as disrespect. The ancient Near East was connected through a network of courts. Egypt stood inside that network, but its position changed over time. During the New Kingdom, Egypt became an imperial power. Its armies moved north into the Levant. Its rulers demanded tribute. Foreign territories were placed under Egyptian influence. Temples celebrated the wealth flowing into Egypt. Yet empire was expensive. Armies had to be supplied. Fortresses had to be maintained. Officials had to be appointed. Rebellions had to be suppressed. The farther the empire expanded, the more resources were required to maintain it. Eventually, Egyptian influence weakened. Other powers became stronger. The Hittites, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. Egypt's history was therefore not a story of uninterrupted dominance. It was a story of changing balance. Sometimes Egypt was the empire. Sometimes Egypt was part of an empire. Sometimes Egypt was struggling to remain independent. The Nile remained constant. Politics did not. This distinction between landscape and power is important. A king may believe his reign will last forever, but the river does not care. The flood arrives. The crops grow. The king dies. Another king takes his place. A dynasty disappears. The fields remain. The Egyptians themselves expressed this awareness through their monuments. They sought permanence because they knew life was temporary. The more they built for eternity, the more obvious mortality became. Every pyramid is, in some sense, a monument to death. But it is also a monument to life, to human ambition, to organization, to belief, to fear, to love. A tomb was built because someone expected a future beyond death. A name was carved because someone wanted to be remembered. An offering was placed because someone believed the dead still needed it. The objects surrounding a mummy were not random. They formed a message. You existed. You mattered. You belonged to this family. You were part of this world. And we have not forgotten you. Perhaps that is why the discovery of intact tombs can feel so emotional. The objects are not simply ancient. They are personal. A cup that once belonged to someone. A necklace worn by someone. A chair someone sat upon. A toy once held by a child. These objects collapse time. We see the same basic human impulses. To decorate. To comfort. To protect. To remember. To prepare for the future. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with the future. But not necessarily the future we imagine. Their greatest concern was eternity. The continuation of existence beyond the human lifespan. This is why the sun became such a powerful symbol. Every evening the sun disappeared, yet every morning it returned. To an Egyptian observer, this was not merely astronomy. It was a cosmic promise. The world could be renewed. Death could be followed by rebirth. The sun god Ra traveled through the underworld each night and emerged again. The journey could be dangerous, but the cycle continued. The story offered a model for human existence. A person dies. The body is preserved. The spirit travels. Judgment occurs. And, if everything is successful, the deceased joins the eternal order. This belief shaped architecture so deeply that even the orientation of monuments could carry meaning. Temples were aligned. Tombs were positioned. The relationship between the structure and the landscape mattered. The Egyptians did not build randomly. They built within a symbolic geography. The eastern bank of the Nile was associated with the rising sun and life. The western bank, where the sun set, became strongly associated with the dead. This is why many major cemeteries were located west of the river. The geography itself became a metaphor. East, birth, west, death. Every day the sun crossed between them. The landscape repeated the story of existence. And if we imagine the Nile at sunset, the symbolism becomes almost impossible to miss. The water reflects the orange sky. The western cliffs turn dark. A boat moves quietly across the river. The sun disappears. For the Egyptians, this was not the end. It was part of a cycle. The darkness would come, then morning. Again. And again. For thousands of years. Perhaps that is why ancient Egyptian civilization can feel so calm even when its history is filled with violence. Its worldview was built around cycles. Flood. Growth. Harvest. Dryness. Death. Renewal. The individual life was brief. The cycle was enormous. And the purpose of civilization was to preserve order within that cycle. But eventually, even the cycle of Egyptian civilization itself would change beyond recognition. Foreign rulers would come. New languages would dominate. New religions would replace old ones. The temples would close. The hieroglyphs would become unreadable. And the ancient system would become memory. But the Nile would continue. The river that had created the civilization would outlive its kings. And it would continue doing what it had always done. Moving north. Carrying soil. Reflecting the sky. separating desert from farmland, connecting communities. Generations would come and go. The river would remain. That continuity gives ancient Egypt its particular atmosphere. It is not simply a civilization we study. It is a civilization we can still physically encounter. You can stand beside the Nile. You can see the desert. You can walk among temples. You can touch stone carved thousands of years ago. The distance between then and now becomes almost tangible. But perhaps the most moving place is not a famous temple. It is a tomb, a quiet chamber, a name written on a wall, a figure painted in profile, a small offering, a scene of a family. The tomb tells us something simple. Someone expected to be remembered. Someone believed that the future mattered. And now, thousands of years later, we are still looking, still reading, still remembering. The civilization succeeded in the one thing it feared losing. It remained present, not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to make us pause. Enough to make us wonder what our own civilization will leave behind. Because one day, every modern city will become archaeology. The buildings we consider permanent will decay. The roads will crack. The technology will become obsolete. Languages will change. Names will disappear. Future people may find fragments of our lives and try to understand us. They may look at our houses, our machines, our books, our photographs, our monuments, and they may ask the same questions we ask about Egypt. Who were these people? What did they believe? What did they fear? What did they love? How did they live? What did they think would last forever? Ancient Egypt gives us no answer for our own future, but it gives us a warning. Nothing remains exactly as it was. Even the greatest civilization changes. The question is not whether we will disappear. Eventually, every civilization changes. The question is what survives. A monument, a story, a name, a fragment, a memory, perhaps even a small object buried beneath the earth. The Egyptians believed that speaking a person's name could help keep that person alive. So tonight, when we speak the names of their kings and queens, their workers and scribes, their families and children, we participate in something very old. We remember. And for a moment, the ancient world is not completely gone. The Nile is still moving. The stars are still above the desert. The temples are still standing in the darkness. And somewhere beyond the last light of the horizon, the ancient Egyptian world continues inside the imagination. Quiet. Patient. Waiting. Not for us to solve every mystery, but simply to listen, because the past rarely speaks in a single voice. It whispers through stone, through sand, through broken pottery, through faded paint, through the names of people who believed they would live forever. And if we listen long enough, we may realize that the most extraordinary thing about ancient Egypt was never the size of its monuments. It was the fact that ordinary human beings, living beside a river thousands of years ago, looked at the same sky we see tonight. They watched the sun disappear. They watched the stars appear. They held their children. They worried about tomorrow. They remembered yesterday. And they wondered what came after death. Those questions have crossed the entire distance of history. The world has changed. We have changed. But the questions remain. And perhaps that is why Egypt still feels so close. Because beneath the language, beneath the religion, beneath the kings and temples, there was simply a human desire. To live. To love. To leave something behind. And to be remembered. The desert is quiet now. The river moves beneath the moon. The ancient temples stand beneath the stars. And the names carved into stone remain, waiting patiently in the darkness. For someone to read them. For someone to remember. for someone thousands of years later to whisper, "You were here." There is one final thought worth carrying with us as we leave the ancient Nile. The Egyptians spent their lives preparing for eternity. They built tombs. They carved names. They painted scenes of food, family, music, farming, and celebration. They preserved bodies. They performed rituals. They created monuments that seemed almost impossibly permanent. And yet, they could not control what happened after they were gone. No king could command the future. No priest could guarantee that a name would be remembered. No architect could prevent stone from weathering. No ruler could stop another civilization from rising. Eventually, every human creation becomes vulnerable to time. And still they built. Perhaps that is the most human thing about ancient Egypt. They knew life was temporary, and they built anyway. A farmer planted crops even though he knew he would not live forever. A craftsman carved stone even though he would never see how long it survived. A parent taught a child even though generations would eventually separate them from their descendants. A scribe carefully copied words onto papyrus even though he could not know whether anyone thousands of years later would understand them. They worked within the limits of their own lives. And somehow, those small acts accumulated into one of the longest civilizations in human history. That civilization was never one unchanging kingdom. It rose. It divided. It reunited. It expanded. It retreated. It adopted foreign influences. It changed its gods. It changed its capitals. It changed its rulers. But something remained. The river. The fields. The desert. The memory of the ancestors. And the belief that order mattered. For ancient Egyptians, the world was not supposed to descend into chaos. Ma'at had to be maintained. The sun had to rise. The river had to nourish the land. The dead had to be remembered. The living had responsibilities. The king had responsibilities. The gods had responsibilities. Every part of existence belonged to a larger order. And perhaps this is why the ancient Egyptian world feels so different from our own. Modern life often moves forward. Ancient Egyptian thought repeatedly looked backward and forward at the same time. The ancestors mattered.
Tradition mattert.
The past provided legitimacy. The future promised continuation. Time was not simply a road. It was a cycle. Morning followed night. Flood followed drought. Planting followed harvest. Life followed death. Death could lead to renewal. The same patterns appeared again and again. And the people living beside the Nile understood that they were part of something much larger than themselves. Imagine the river tonight. The water is dark. The desert is almost invisible. The wind moves softly across the reeds. Somewhere far away, a modern city is still awake. Cars pass. Lights shine. People look at screens. Messages cross the world in seconds. Our civilization has technologies the ancient Egyptians could never have imagined. And yet, if the lights disappeared and the noise became quiet, the sky above Egypt would still be familiar. The stars would remain. The moon would move across the darkness. The sun would rise in the east. The river would continue north. The basic rhythm would remain. This is perhaps the final connection between our world and theirs. We occupy the same planet. Under the same sky, we inherit the same human fears. The fear of death. The desire for security. The desire to protect our children. The desire to be loved. The desire to leave something meaningful behind. The ancient Egyptians expressed those desires through tombs and temples. We express them through different things. But the impulse is remarkably similar. We want our lives to matter. We want someone to remember that we were here. And that is exactly what happened to ancient Egypt. They were here. They lived beside the Nile. They built their homes. They raised their children. They buried their dead. They prayed to their gods. They argued with their neighbors. They celebrated festivals. They worried about harvests. They feared illness. They watched kings rise and fall. They watched the seasons change. They lived ordinary lives inside an extraordinary civilization. Most of their names are gone. Most of their voices are gone. Most of their homes have disappeared. But enough survived. Painted wall. A broken statue. A piece of pottery. A forgotten letter. A burial chamber. A tiny amulet. A grain of ancient wheat. A child's toy. A name carved into stone. Together, these fragments form a bridge. And across that bridge, the distant past becomes human again. The pyramids no longer seem like mysterious objects created by an unknown people. They become the work of workers, engineers, surveyors, stonecutters, transporters, administrators, farmers, families. The temples become more than monuments. They become places where people once entered carrying offerings. The tombs become more than dark chambers. They become attempts to protect people from being forgotten. The hieroglyphs become more than symbols. They become voices. And the mummies become more than archaeological specimens. They become the remains of human beings who once believed, as we do, that their lives mattered. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson Egypt leaves behind. Not how to build a pyramid. Not how to create a mummy. Not how to rule an empire. But how powerful memory can be. A civilization can disappear politically and still survive culturally. A language can become silent and still be rediscovered. A king can be forgotten and still return to history. A city can become buried beneath sand and still speak again. Time can cover the past, but it cannot always erase it. Sometimes all it takes is a fragment, a broken piece, a name, a single line of writing, and suddenly, a person who died thousands of years ago is no longer completely lost. We know they existed. We know they stood somewhere beneath this same sun. And for a brief moment across thousands of years, we meet them. That is the quiet miracle of history. It does not bring the dead back, but it allows us to remember that they lived. And perhaps that is enough. The Nile continues its journey. The fields become green, then golden. The harvest comes. The harvest goes. The sun crosses the sky. Night returns. And somewhere along the western horizon, where the ancient Egyptians once imagined the sun entering the world of the dead, the last light disappears. The temples become silhouettes. The desert becomes dark. The statues stand quietly. The names remain carved into stone. And the civilization that once seemed eternal becomes what all civilizations eventually become. A memory. But not an empty one. A memory filled with people. With voices. With hopes. With mistakes. With achievements. With beauty. With suffering. With questions. The same questions we still ask when the night becomes quiet. Who were we? Why are we here? What happens when we die? Will anyone remember us? The ancient Egyptians spent thousands of years answering those questions. Their answers belonged to their world. Ours will belong to ours. But the questions themselves have survived. And perhaps that is why, after more than 4,000 years, the Nile still feels like a road through human memory. A road connecting one generation to another. One civilization to another. One human life to another. So let the river carry us gently away now. Past the fields. Past the villages. Past the silent temples. Past the great monuments rising from the desert. The stars are above us. The water is calm. The ancient city has gone quiet. There is no need to hurry. The story has already waited thousands of years. Can wait a little longer. Tonight the pharaohs can rest. The scribes can rest. The farmers can rest. The craftsmen can rest. The mothers and fathers can rest. The children whose names were lost to time can rest. Their world is quiet again. And perhaps, in that quiet, the past feels less distant. Not because we have traveled backward, but because, for a little while, we remembered. The Nile flows beneath the moon. The desert sleeps. The stones remain. And somewhere in the darkness, an ancient name is still waiting to be spoken. You were here. You lived. You dreamed. You were remembered. And now, as the night deepens, we leave ancient Egypt exactly where we found it. Beneath the stars. Beside the river. In the quiet between one age and the next. Let the sound of the water fade. Let the desert become still. And let the last image remain only for a moment. A distant temple. A dark river. A sky filled with stars. Then darkness. And silence.